Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. We're joined by Stephen Moore. He's Ukraine Freedom Project, to unpack a political storm in Ukraine. President Zelensky's attempt to limit the independence of key anti-corruption agencies triggered fierce backlash at home and from the EU and further afield. Days later, he reversed course with a new bill restoring their powers. What does this mean for Ukraine's democracy, anti-corruption fight and EU ambitions? Well, Mr. Moore joins us to provide expert insight on these pivotal developments. Stephen, welcome back to TVP World and thank you for taking the time.
Of course, Ashim, it's always great to be with you.
Thank you. So you actually just returned from the States.
I am not even over jet lag yet.
You haven't started your jet lag yet. Right. So tell me, I know you've been talking to some influential people while you were there. What was the general reaction to what was going on with Ukraine's anti-corruption legislation and so on?
Yeah, well, I landed on the day that about 3 weeks ago when Donald Trump started saying, let's look at sending weapons to Ukraine. Let's talk about sanctions, secondary sanctions on Russia. And that was a really good day. I happened to have a meeting with Senator Lindsey Graham that day. And he said, Stephen, the tide is turning. And there was this real feeling in Washington that the wind was at our back because, it's been difficult to get Trump to support Ukraine. It's been difficult to get Trump's voters to support Ukraine, and Trump has to listen to his voters, and to some degree. And so, and then, just recently, this news of dismantling NABU, the anti-corruption organization, it was just like, everybody I talked to said, what is he thinking about? This was the absolute worst message to send at the most crucial time. And, if I was to advise Vladimir Putin on how to blow up the weapons deal with Trump, I would tell him to do something like this.
Right. So, but what was your thought? I mean, after he, because he started reversing course before you left, was there a sense that says, well, I think he's seen the error of his ways and he's going to correct, route correct? Or did it leave people with a bad taste in their mouths?
But so we're talking Zelenskyy, right? Yeah. The damage is done. So what this does is this hands a gift to the people that oppose Ukraine, because every other allegation of corruption and authoritarianism that's been levied against President Zelenskyy has been false. And this one is, it stinks really bad.
Right.
And there's no separating him from it.
Right.
So,
but you see, it does bring us, I suppose, to the question, well, why do it? Because thus far, as you say, there's been very little hint of corruption in him personally and the way he's been running the government. So surely he must have seen how this might, what the optics were like. Why do it?
Well, what I've seen, because I've been building support among conservatives for Ukraine for, since the beginning of the war now. And, I got to Ukraine on day 5 of the war. And the Zelenskyy administration has had misstep after misstep after misstep with Republicans. And they seem to display an inability to learn. And, it was interesting. There's an article in Politico you may have seen about Yermak, which is Zelensky's chief of staff. And he said, I have no desire to learn all the ins and outs of U.S. politics. Well, and I thought that actually showed some strength of character to admit his shortcomings like that, because someone needs to learn the ins and outs of U.S. politics. Take Winston Churchill in World War II. That guy had a room full of people whose full-time job was to figure out how to get Roosevelt to send weapons to England.
Right. And of course the EU is critical. Poland, of course, being a launching pad for many of the things that go into Ukraine, the weaponry and other supplies. How much effort is Zelenskyy making to understand the machinations of the EU?
Yeah, difficult to say. I mean, I think that they've been leading the charge on a lot of the anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine because that will be a requirement for Ukraine to get into the EU, which is kind of the reason all this stuff started with Russia, right?
Right.
But I did see today, I just glanced at a headline on the way in here, and the EU was supposed to send 4 billion euro, and they said because of the slowing of reforms, they were going to send 3 billion. So it was not specific to this thing with Nabu, but, it looks like this foolishness has cost Ukraine €1 billion.
Right. Or certainly suspended €1 billion that it could have got earlier. Now, I mean, Zelenskyy said, well, because the reason I'm doing it is to reduce the Russian influence in our anti-corruption bodies. Did he have a point?
I don't know. I actually know a couple of people in the anti-corruption community, and nobody has given me a solid answer on whether or not that's true. But to me, it sounds a lot like, Nabu is full of Russians and Ukraine is full of Nazis. And so, it's that same kind of message, right? And therefore we're justified in doing what we're doing.
Right.
And so if it is full of Russians, then there is easier, let me say this. Unless those Russians are about to burst out of Nabu and take over Kyiv, the route that they took to do this was by far the wrong route.
Right. What do you think of the new approach that Zelenskyy has taken with the new legislation? Yeah,
listen, I think it's great, and it's good to see that they've done this. As I said before,
and quickly.
Yeah, and quickly. Yeah, so they did quickly learn the error of their ways, and that is good. But again, this is just another thing hanging out there. Because I was in Iowa talking to conservatives in Iowa and Oklahoma. This is the heartland of America, and I talked to them. Well, what do you think about sending aid to Ukraine? And the answer is, well, listen, I think we should look at it. I'm listening carefully to what President Trump has to say. But you know what? Zelenskyy, I really worry because Zelensky's so corrupt. And so he has now reinforced that with Trump's base, which is the folks I work with.
Right.
And they were willing to give Ukraine another look. And now this is the wind is going the other direction.
Right. I mean, there was some talk that EU leaders were talking about, how do we get Ukraine into the EU and bypass Hungary, so that we don't get held up by Hungary. And apparently that's all blown up. I mean, do you think that's a permanent?
Well, you and I both know that Hungary is, Putin's representative in the EU.
Right.
I mean, and so Hungary does worse on the Transparency Index for corruption than Ukraine. So it is kind of laughable. Those guys would say they're too corrupt to come into the EU.
Right.
But it does give another stick for Ukraine's enemies to hit them with.
All right. How would you assess Ukraine's path towards EU accession? Have they made the fundamental changes that, the conversation started just after the war started in February 2022? So they've had 3.5 years. Have you seen tangible differences in the way Ukraine operates?
I lived in Ukraine in 2018 and 2019 prior to the war. And the difference then and the difference now is pretty stark. And it's, when I ask, because you got to have the people buy into the anti-corruption reforms as well. And I've gone to the front like 50 times, and I asked soldiers there, have you seen any corruption? It's particularly around U.S. weapons. And the standard answer is some variation on no, and if I did, I would shoot that person. So, I always tell people in America, talking about corruption in Ukraine, after the war and before the war is like talking about airport security in America before 9/11.
Right.
You know? And it's just a dramatic change.
Different set of parameters, I suppose,
Yeah.
different paradigm. Now, there were protests, enormous protests in Ukraine at Zelensky's original legislation, because those that attended the protests at the Maidan in 2014 felt let down. Was that the message you were getting? I mean, because those guys were much younger. I mean, this is, whatever,
I hope
13 years later.
I'm heading back to Kyiv tomorrow. I hope they're there when I get back. I want to go shake their hands.
Yeah.
Because I think the message that presents to the world, this is a silver lining in this whole thing, which is that people want to call Zelenskyy an authoritarian, and he's helping him do that. But at the same time, people went out in the streets. They spoke to their leader. Their leader changed directions. That doesn't happen in Russia. And so I think that showing the world that, how do you tell if the Ukrainian people are unhappy with their government? Well, are there thousands or millions of them in the street? Okay, they're fine right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell me, apart from these protests, there hasn't been that much resistance to Zelensky's execution of the war, or has there?
People are tired, and I don't think I've not heard anyone say Zelensky's screwing up the war or anything like that. But people are tired, and so Zelenskyy, being the president, bears some of the brunt of that. And listen, I think that the execution of the war, whether it's Zelenskyy, the generals, or whoever it is, look, I've been telling people this resonates in the United States when you tell them that Ukraine, that essentially doesn't have a navy, has shut off the Black Sea for the Russian Navy. You tell them about Operation Spiderweb, $100,000 worth of drones took out $7 billion in Russian aircraft. And there's story after story after story like that. Vladimir Putin has lost almost 250,000 soldiers just this year, and he's taken back. He's taken a part of Ukraine that's equal to about half the size of Palm Beach County, which is where President Trump lives.
Right.
Yeah, so it's nothing for thousands of men.
Yeah. Well, so Russia's paying this enormous price, driven, it seems, by Putin's ego. And yet he seems not to even be interested in talking about some kind of ceasefire or some kind of peace deal. I mean, the meeting in Istanbul, all it ended up with was an exchange of prisoners of war. Or was there something else? I don't know.
Yeah, here's what I see, is that Putin's just not going to stop until someone makes him stop. He's going to go after Ukraine and then probably the Baltic states. Poland is somewhere on the list. And so until someone shows him strength. Donald Trump thought he had a relationship with him that would enable him to just work it out with his friend Vladimir and shut off the war. And Trump is finding that that's not the case because, again, Vladimir Putin responds to strength. So it's really good, I think, that Trump has educated himself in this way, because he's had to go through some trial and error with Putin, and he's recognized that no, this guy is not an honest broker.
No, it doesn't seem to be. So there's nothing, just in the final word, there's nothing really apart from being stopped forcibly that will bring Putin to the negotiating table.
Well, if you look at his economy, I mean, his own economy minister said, we're going into a recession. He is just on cash, he's paying his soldiers twice what a U.S. entry-level soldier gets, and their average monthly wage is 20%. So he has got an unsustainable rate of pay for his soldiers. He's spending, a lot of money on drones, Unfortunately, he's lost like 12,000 tanks, and those tanks are, a couple of $1 million a piece.
Right.
So he is spending, he's spent through most of his national wealth fund. All of his companies are leveraged. So this could be something that stops rather quickly if they're able to implement these sanctions, these secondary sanctions, to stop the flow of oil to Russia.
All right. Well, we shall see how quickly they start to bite. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. Take care. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.